Yeah. You're live.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so delighted and so grateful to have the one and only Michael Sandel. Now, by way of introduction, Michael Sandel is, quote, America's greatest moral philosopher. He teaches political philosophy at Harvard, and his writings on justice, ethics, democracy, and markets have been translated into 27 languages. His course, Justice, is the first to be made freely available online and on television, viewed by tens of millions worldwide. In China, Michael Sandel was named the most influential foreign figure of the year. Now, the accolades and the writings go on, but Michael's books include What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, The Case Against Perfection, Democracy's Discontent, and a forthcoming book that I'm so excited to discuss and engage with, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. Michael Sandel has served on the President's Council on Bioethics, is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A graduate of Brandeis, he received his doctorate from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And again, America's greatest moral philosopher. Please join us. Thank you, Michael Sandel.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. What an introduction. It's great to be with you.
So good to see you again from within our self-quarantines. And let's get started.
Okay.
I'm going to read by foray into our dialectic, into our conversation, a brief quote from you. The mainstream parties and governing elites who find themselves the target of populist protests struggle to make sense of it. They typically diagnose the discontent in one of two ways: as animus against immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities, or as anxiety in the face of globalization and technological change. Both diagnoses, says Michael Sandel, miss something important. What is that thing we're missing?
I want first to say that both of those diagnoses touch on an important element of truth in making sense of the populist backlash that has upended politics and democracies around the world, with Brexit in the UK in 2016, with the election of Trump. But I think what they miss are two sources of anger and frustration that are legitimate and that the mainstream parties need to pay attention to and think about and respond to. One of them is the fact that over the past 4 decades, the version of globalization that we've had has heaped enormous rewards on those at the top, but has left the average working person not only with stagnant wages have flatlined for 4 decades, median wages, but also with the loss of social esteem, with the lack of social recognition and respect. And so that's the first, and closely connected to that is a set of attitudes towards success that make this inequality all the more toxic and polarizing. And at the heart of this attitude towards success is a certain idea that comes from meritocracy, the idea that if we live in a society with more or less equal opportunity, that those on top, those who land on top, have done it on their own, that they therefore deserve all the rewards that markets shower upon those who land on top in today's economy. And by implication, that those who don't land on top, those who may struggle to make ends meet, have no one to blame than themselves. This idea, I call it a meritocratic hubris. It's the successful inhaling too deeply of their success. And so when we hear that behind the populist protest is a sense of resentment that those on top are looking down with disdain. I think this is not entirely false. And I think that the mainstream parties have a blind spot, not only to the inequality, which they've failed to address, but also to these toxic attitudes towards success and the social exclusion that goes with them.
But isn't it just the economy, right? I mean, this has been the mantra now, the defining message, especially of the neoliberal consensus for decades, has been, well, it's about jobs, it's about the economy. And Michael Sandel, you're trying to add this fluffy notion, this idea of the common good and that people feel looked down upon. Isn't it just about wages? Isn't it just about, I mean, coming from, my kind of context and bias, we automated away millions of manufacturing jobs in these communities. Isn't that enough?
Well, it's certainly a big part of the problem. But I would say it's not only the economy stupid, as the slogan went, going back to the Clinton years, the Bill Clinton years. It's also the culture. And the economy and the culture are entangled with one another. It's not really possible to separate them. Here's why. When we speak about the economy, we typically think about GDP, about jobs, about wages. And these things are hugely important. But an economy, more broadly conceived, is a system of social cooperation and social recognition that allocates not just money, but also social esteem and recognition and honor. And that's why I think we make a mistake to drive too sharp a wedge between economic issues on the one hand and cultural issues on the other. If people find that the work they do is not respected or recognized or rewarded, not only will they suffer in their pocketbooks, they will also suffer a sense of social exclusion, a sense that the work they do is no longer recognized as a central contribution to the common good. So I'm trying to broaden our conception. I'm not in any way, Jonathan, disputing the importance of the economy, but I'm trying to broaden our conception of what it means to have a healthy and thriving economy, and to include the elements of social recognition and esteem and inclusion that are bound up with the rewards we accord, the material, but also the honorific rewards that we accord to the contributions people make to our shared economic life.
You also draw some really interesting parallels and points to this crisis we're living through, where 30 million people have now filed for unemployment. More than 10 million have tried to file for unemployment. More than 50,000 are dead. In New York City alone, the epicenter for this crisis, New York City is leading in the country in deaths. The United States is leading the world in fatalities and in infections. And recently, a former CDC director noted that if New York City had closed just 10 days sooner, we could have avoided 50 to 70% of deaths. And the Surgeon General, the World Health Organization, the mayor of New York, all of our elites and all of our sense-making machines, the people that are, is their duty to represent and protect the public interest and public health, for weeks and for months, denied basic human intuition that a mouth covering, that a mask would be effective. And so help us unwrap and untangle, how does this relate to what you see now perhaps for decades. And I'm not sure at what point you might say this started, or if there ever was a point at which we had this common good embedded in our politics.
Right.
But there's a very stark cost in human life that we're paying today.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And what you're saying, Jonathan, and I agree very much with this, is that elites have failed. This has been a failure of leadership, and we've seen it in the pandemic, especially the federal response to the pandemic and how delayed it was and how haphazard. But it's a broader failure of elites that goes back about 4 decades. If you look at and there's an irony here, which is at the very time when elites and the governing classes and the professional classes and the mainstream politicians are displaying a kind of meritocratic hubris, a sense of self-satisfaction for having been winners in a market-driven global economy. They've governed pretty poorly. They brought us the financial crisis of 2008. They brought us the Iraq War. They brought us a 19-year inconclusive war in Afghanistan, the longest in American history. They brought us a decaying infrastructure. They brought us a system of campaign finance and gerrymandered congressional districts that makes a mockery of democracy. And now this rather haphazard and delayed response to the pandemic. If you compare the performance of elites over the past 4 decades, the era of a kind of market triumphalist or neoliberal globalization, it's far worse, actually, than the performance of elites during the previous 4 decades, which is to say in the period from World War II to, say, the late 1970s. They had their flaws, the most grievous being, of course, the Vietnam War. But the elites of that era won the Second World War, rebuilt Europe, created the Great Society, brought about, however fitfully, the civil rights movement, desegregation, and brought 4 decades of economic growth that was broadly shared. Whereas the elites who presided over the last 4 decades of globalization brought skewed the kind of created the inequalities that we see today, where almost all the rewards of economic growth for 40 years went to the top 10 or 20%, and the bottom half of the population had almost zero benefit from the economic growth. So this is not to say that the decades following the Second World War were a golden age. Far from it. But I do think that from the 1980s and the 90s until now, elites have failed, and the failure is connected to a certain picture of the economy, a certain approach to globalization, also attitudes toward technology and automation, which you mentioned, Jonathan, that treated technology, and in many ways globalization too, as if these were unalterable forces, like the weather, that had nothing to do with human agency, but to which we had simply to adapt. And I think this was a deeply disempowering way that actually fueled the inequality and the oligarchic capture of democratic institutions. So by the common good, I mean something perhaps not terribly ambitious, but a more responsible mode of democratic governance that tries to bring economic forces to democratic account and acknowledges the political choices that are being made, rather than hiding behind a veneer of technocracy and technology and globalization as if these were purely autonomous forces, as if given by nature outside of human control. I think there's a deep failure in that.
So there are many hypotheses,
Yeah.
many reasons why we might call this the Great Nap, or the series of 3, 4, 5 decades of this convergence of trends, the hyper financialization of our economy, the returns to capital growing, the returns to labor stagnating or decreasing. Now, I'm curious, what is the Michael Sandel thesis for why? Next, we'll get to, well, what's the way forward, but what is your fundamental why?
Well, I think it's essentially been a political failure of historic proportions. And it's a political failure bound up with a certain conception of the economy and of the relation between politics and economics. And it's connected to a mistaken idea of what an economy is for, that it was remarkably detached from the common good. During one breakpoint really was the 1980s. And during that time, we had Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher argue that government is the problem and markets are the solution. And so they argued for laissez-faire, free market capitalism, essentially, and called it freedom. But when they passed from the political scene, the center-left figures who replaced them, Bill Clinton in the US, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, they did not challenge the fundamental premise of the market triumphalist public philosophy of the Reagan-Thatcher years. They moderated, but consolidated the market faith. And by market faith, I mean the assumption that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They accepted that basic premise. We never really had a public debate about it. They accepted the premise and tried to soften its harsh edges to some degree. As a result, we didn't then, and haven't had since, really a debate about what should be the role of markets and market reasoning in a just society. And then came the financial crisis of 2008. And it seemed as though now at last, the system has melted down. The deregulation of finance hasn't gone so well. It's introduced rather than, it's compounded rather than reduced systemic risk and so on. At last, we will have a debate about the financialization of the economy, about its effect on the real economy. To what extent does it help? To what extent does it hurt? What should be the role of money in markets in a good society? But that debate never happened. After 2008, we did have a kind of debate about reform. It was a pretty circumscribed debate about how to reform the system to try to deal with too big to fail and to try to reduce systemic risk. And even those measures were pretty modest. But we didn't have this broader debate. And so the role, for example, of monopoly, of scale, of big banks, and of their outsized power economically and politically, that was not really called into question. And the inequality grew. There was not a serious debate about how to contend with inequality. And I think that that debate was short-circuited because, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I'm just wondering because, you know, part of what makes you so exciting and divergent in many ways to me is because you call for this notion of democratic debate, of public space, of common good, when in many ways this can seem so foreign to us. Yeah. And I would love two things. One, because you really are the best at explaining and just making more concrete, like, what do you mean by the boundaries of markets? Like, what do you mean by the limits of marketization, of what money can't buy? So I guess we will start there, just to parse out a little bit more. What does this stuff even mean in practice?
Right. Well, some of the debates about the role of money in markets are familiar, even though they've not been addressed very effectively. For example, the role of money in political campaigns. We're familiar with that debate, and we do have it to some extent, though we've not addressed it adequately. And also the debates about healthcare do involve the underlying question, to what extent should access to healthcare be on the basis of the ability to pay, and to what extent should it be on the basis of universal, on the basis of medical need. So here are two concrete examples of debates we do have, though not terribly successfully, but we do have them. We're familiar with them in terms of the role and reach of money and markets. Where should markets govern, and where should other norms, like medical need, be decisive, or democratic voice be decisive? But there are many other aspects of life where we don't really question the role of money in markets. You mentioned the financialization of the economy, Jonathan. This is something that doesn't really loom very large in public debate. And yet, it's deeply consequential. It seems pretty arcane. What does it mean that finance accounts for a greater and greater share in recent decades of GDP and of corporate profits? Why does that matter? And doesn't increased liquidity, for example, simply contribute to economic efficiency and therefore to economic growth in the real economy? We don't really have a debate about that. So here would be one way of framing such a debate, to make it concrete and susceptible of political debate. The payroll, see, my worry is that the unacknowledged effect of financialization is on the esteem and recognition accorded to work in the traditional sense, in the real economy, providing useful goods and services, as most people do with their lives, that are valuable. And so here's a concrete example of an issue, Jonathan, that could at least force this debate or prompt this debate. The payroll tax is a tax on work. And because it's capped, it also has a regressive element, but it's a tax on work. It makes work more expensive, both for workers and for employers. Suppose we considered reducing or eliminating the payroll tax in exchange for, let's say, a tax on some form of a financial transactions tax, maybe in combination with a tax on carbon. Now, we could debate this question from the standpoint of how much revenue would be raised. Would it be revenue neutral? What would be the incidence? What would be the incidence of the shift in taxation? Would it be regressive? Would it be progressive? But I think we should debate that from a further point of view, and this is the point of view of the common good. What would be the impact of that shift in the way we raise taxes on the message society sends about what forms of work and what forms of contribution we want to honor and recognize and prize? Today, during the pandemic, we applaud and we call heroes those who are risking their health and their lives in the hospitals, to be sure, but for that matter, delivery workers, cashiers in grocery stores, truckers, home care workers. We shower them with sentimental praise, which is a good thing. But the economy is not configured really to recognize and reward people who do these very concrete in-person tasks. So I would like to connect this moment when there is a glimmer of recognition. We call them, after all, essential workers, but the economy doesn't treat them as very essential. To the contrary, the economy treats these workers as marginal, not essential. So the debate of, let's say, the proposal to shift from the payroll tax to a financial transactions tax and a carbon tax or a wealth tax would be one way of forcing this issue. What would you think of that as a way of making concrete this rather otherwise abstract idea of the common good?
So I have two follow-ups, but
Yeah.
one example that came to mind, I just remember in our previous conversations was the market, for instance, for organs, just as one of the sort of hotter topics that really push some of the edge cases. Like recently in right here in New York, we legalized gestational surrogacy and for same-sex couples. And so you've really been at the forefront of this true debate around what are the boundaries for what money can buy. And that was just the example that came to mind when it becomes very stark when you talk about body parts and people.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Let me give you one other example of that kind, stark kind, Jonathan, that's coming up now. Everyone is desperate to find a vaccine for the coronavirus.
Right.
And one stage of the testing involves testing. It requires test subjects, human test subjects.
Right.
And so pharmaceutical companies are hiring and paying healthy people to test these drugs, the vaccines, but also the treatment drugs. What about that? If there is a substantial risk involved, a safety risk, and in some cases, this is even a harder one. The only way to test, well, there's tests for safety, which is one thing, and for efficacy. And for efficacy, you could try to limit the testing only to those people, if it's a treatment, who already have the coronavirus. But if it's a vaccine, to test for efficacy, you need healthy test subjects. Is it fair to pay them, to hire them?
So this is partly where my obsession and emphasis on a universal basic income comes from, because I think so many of your powerful hypotheticals maybe become weaker edge cases, become less morally challenging if we know that fundamentally everyone is free from coercion. If we can establish at the outset, a priori, that anyone who might participate in anything you might deem morally repugnant or challenging or threaten their own lives or the lives of others, as long as we know they're not being coerced, then maybe that eases some of the moral challenge.
Okay, fair enough, Jonathan. But then I want to ask, how generous a universal basic income would we have to offer to meet that threshold? I mean, if it's $1,200, what is it? $1,200 a month?
So
what would it be for an individual?
For sure. So let's say for an individual during the pandemic, during let's say the 12 to 18 months, it would be $2,000 a month per individual, per American.
All right. So if it's a single person, so we're talking $24,000 a year income. So that's certainly, in terms of people who are struggling and
as
who
a
are
floor,
wrestling,
as a floor,
as a floor, I understand, and who face the kinds of hard choices, whether to become a guinea pig for a possibly dangerous test, $24,000 a year. That would certainly help. And it would eliminate people who do this out of sheer and utter desperation to have enough food to eat. And even that is just for an emergency period, I take it. I don't know, would that be the permanent proposal, Jonathan, or would that be for this 18-month period?
So that would be during the COVID pandemic, but then thereafter, in perpetuity, forever, every single American adult would be guaranteed $1,000 a month for the rest of their lives, and every single American child would be guaranteed $500 a month for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Well, I think this could go some way, depending on what the other aspects of the safety net were. For example, whether we're part of a system that included universal health care. So I think it would help, and it would help reduce some of the coercion objections associated with these hard uses of markets that play on desperation. Whether it would be sufficient, I mean, I have no objection to the universal basic income, but I think it so much depends on filling in other aspects of a policy, and I suspect you agree with that.
Yes, and I think even if we were to keep pushing and finding this equilibrium point of some set of social services guarantee, I think part of your argument is that there is some expressive function, there is some symbolic function, there's some notion of esteem or worth or dignity that even checks on their own will not suffice. They might take you a whole long way from where we are now, from abject poverty. But can you speak to it and just this expressive function, this symbolic function? Do you think that is isn't that always inferior to if you have to choose between one or the other, like the economics, the cash, the cold cash itself?
Well, I don't think we should see it as a choice. And here's where I think cash alone, though it can be enormously helpful, especially in alleviating poverty or desperate circumstances, isn't enough for the following basic reason. If we're talking about how to configure the economy in the world of work, then work serves two functions. Now, you might say, well, one is economic and one is fluffy, expressive functions. I wouldn't put it that way. Work is a way that most people make a living, but it's also a way that people contribute to the common good and achieve, if the society is organized right, recognition and respect for doing so. So if we were to imagine in the abstract a society where people, where the universal basic income were conceived as a replacement for work as an institution, then we would have to ask, are there other ways, other institutions through which people could make contributions to the common good that would be genuine contributions and recognized as such, and therefore the basis of social respect? Now, maybe we could imagine and reconfigure civil society and social life to fill that in. I don't rule that out. But the very fact that we have to address ourselves, I would call it, not only to distributive justice, but to contributive justice, suggests that cash alone is not enough. And here's why. People need to have enough to meet their basic needs. That's why money matters in terms of safety net. But the fundamental, I think the most fundamental human need and civic need is to be needed by others and to be able to answer the needs of others and to be appreciated and recognized for doing so. And cash alone can't provide that.
Now, taking us back to the idea of the public debate or the absence of a public debate around the role of markets and finance and what money can buy generally, was it that we didn't have a debate, or is this just about power? There were there were millions of people protesting. There were, there were elections, people lost, campaigns lost, like certain voices and preferences were not reflected. So wasn't there a debate and then just one side lost?
Well, it was are you talking about in this election round or over the last several decades, Jonathan?
Let's just take, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, right? Yeah. You can say on one side you have basically all of our institutions and mainstream parties, as you put it. Yeah. And then you have protests and people and activists and citizen leaders and organizers, let's say, on the other. Again, just taking as a proxy, let's say Occupy versus the bailout, right? Yeah. So is that not a debate, or is it not a debate because the people in power aren't having it, or because it's not happening in the public sphere? Or is that just a matter of power and politics?
Well, it's both a matter of political argument and a matter of power. And what happened, to take the 2008 financial crisis, it gave rise to movements on both sides of the ideological spectrum. The Occupy movement on the left, the Tea Party movement on the right. And despite their ideological differences, they had in common a sense of anger and outrage and injustice at the way the bailout was done. And the Tea Party movement did a better job of integrating itself into and to some extent capturing a portion of one of the major parties, the Republican Party. The Occupy movement didn't, for whatever reason. It didn't aim at that, or it didn't succeed at that. It could be argued that the candidacy of Bernie Sanders grew out of, not specifically the Occupy movement, but out of the sentiments on the left, the sentiments of protest and discontent about the way the bailout was handled and the power relations that outcome reflected. So after Occupy, the contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton did express some of this debate. But certainly in 2008, 2009, when the Obama administration came in the midst of the financial crisis, although Obama had campaigned for the presidency in a way that inspired a tremendous outpouring of moral and civic idealism and sense of purpose, there was nothing economistic or technocratic about his political appeal in 2008. He took office and embraced and appointed many of the economic advisors who had previously helped deregulate the financial industry and the economy. And so I think that he lost the moral voice that had been so powerful during the campaign and never quite recovered it, in part because of the way the bailout was handled. So then we have the campaign between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton won, Bernie Sanders lost. But so I think there was some debate about that, although the question of finance and the financialization of the economy was debated from the standpoint more of systemic risk than from the standpoint of its implications for the kind of work that's recognized and rewarded and prized. And so that's the kind of debate that I think we still need.
So I want to read another excerpt from you, if that's all right, to kind of frame. And you had referenced this before, but you say it also means that those who land on top, the winners, come to believe that they deserve their success. Now, I mean, they, us, who are we? I mean, are we not part of the elite ourselves? And you say this rings hollow, the idea, the notion, the saying that we are all in this together. Now, you also say elites fail to acknowledge their role, this political response to a political failure of
Right.
historic proportions.
Right.
Now, if you take the example of, let's say, the essential grocery store workers,
Right.
there was a critique recently that came out in the Atlantic, and it said, well, thanks for showering me with praise. Thank you for telling me I'm essential.
Yeah.
But that's not reflected in the, let's say, $8, $10, $12 hourly wage I'm getting. I didn't sign up to be a
Right.
frontline emergency room worker. So
Right.
but then doesn't it come back to money again? And also, doesn't that distance, that gap between that expressive, that symbolic recognition of esteem and dignity and thanks, when it rings hollow, isn't it worse? Or can't it be perceived and hurt doubly?
Yeah. Yes, it can be, and that's why I'm trying to argue. And part of the forthcoming book, The Tyranny of Merit, is really about this, about connecting questions of economics with questions of culture and social recognition and esteem. So, for example, let's consider the essential workers now who are putting their lives on the line, really, to deliver stuff to those of the rest of us who are sitting at home doing our work and having meetings on Zoom. This is a vivid depiction of the class divide, and it calls into question the slogan that we are all in this together. We aren't really. I mean, just look at who is out having to engage in physical contact and deliver stuff and risk catching the coronavirus, and those of us who can sequester safely in the comfort of our own homes and carry on with our work. So how would we make this concrete other than applauding, as we should applaud and celebrate those who are undertaking these risks on our behalf? Well, let's look at the broader structure of the economy. Raising the minimum wage has been a familiar part of political debate, and that, I think, is certainly an important part of this. But what about something going further and considering a wage subsidy? If we really want to honor and recognize what we are now calling essential workers, there's no reason we should say, well, let's let the labor market left to its own devices come up with some estimate of how much they are worth in terms of their social contribution. A minimum wage increase together with a wage subsidy would be one way of giving very concrete, tangible recognition to the work that people, many of whom don't have the kind of college education and credentials and degrees of those who are sitting home holding the meetings on Zoom. Combine that with reducing or eliminating the payroll tax and shifting the burden of taxation to financial transactions, carbon, and possibly wealth. There are lots of ways of doing it, but shifting it away from the people we are now calling essential workers is not just a way of making it easier for them economically. It's also a concrete expression of social recognition of the importance of these roles. That's why I want to bring them together, not keep economics and the money and the recognition apart.
So what happens then, though, if you follow the logic of someone like Yuval Harari, right, who says, well, tens of millions, hundreds of millions around the world, tens of millions in the United States will, in effect, in practice, not be necessary in terms of their skills on the markets?
Well, that's up to us. That's up to us. Here's where I don't accept that technology is like the weather and it's buffeting us about, and we had just better get with the program. The shape technology takes is up to us. It's a social and political choice, what shape, what priorities should direct technology. So, for example, in recent decades, the technological developments that we've had have made it possible to get rid of a lot of middle-income managerial positions, because the technology makes it easier for firms and corporations to be managed by an elite layer of highly educated, credentialed workers. That was a choice. We could have emphasized instead, let's say, the development of technologies that had to do with scanning devices to improve the productivity and therefore the wages of people who work in warehouses. So we can direct and should direct technology if we want to strengthen the role and the productivity of low and middle skilled workers, rather than direct technology in a way that either forces them out or compresses their wages or forces them to compete with low-wage workers overseas and shifts the benefits of productivity to high-level professional managers. That's a choice. So we can direct the technology to a larger extent than we realized.
So I will grant you that, but let's say, yes, it most certainly is a choice. And let's say, Michael Sandel, the choice has been made. The choice is continuing to be deliberately made in the best self-interest of capital, right? Of the, elites of this particular swath that basically decides what policy is. So yes, there is no teleology, there is no inevitability, there is no natural order to the course of events or of technology's impact on our lives, but it has been chosen by those who have chosen. So now what?
Well, that's to say it's a political choice that's been made one way and could be otherwise, which is why committed and idealistic people like you, Jonathan, are going into politics and trying to make things otherwise, to make explicit the choices. See, part of the problem, I think, with globalization and technology is that they are invoked as if they were fixed, apolitical forces. Take globalization. This was the kind of neoliberal version of globalization. The idea that firms should be encouraged through the tax system and in other ways to outsource jobs to low-wage countries and then import those goods. That's a political choice. It's a political choice to do globalization that way. And those who make that decision should be held politically accountable for it, and we should have a debate. Now, too often, those who have made that debate and who have given voice to the resentments and the grievances and the anger that neoliberal versions of globalization have produced have been on the right. And Trump's emphasis on tariffs and complaints about outsourcing, however hypocritical, he made that argument, and it resonated in part because Democrats and progressives did not really mount an effective. Now, that's not true of all of them, not all progressives, but mainstream center-left Democrats have largely failed to consider the implications for workers on these choices. So recognizing that these are political decisions that could be otherwise is the first step toward creating a different kind of politics. But yes, it involves power, which is to say it's political. But the only way of trying to shift that is to try to persuade people, and that requires changing the terms of public discourse, politicizing questions, including big moral and civic questions that we haven't really put at the center of our politics.
So I want to bring in one piece of data that came across my mind recently. And pivot ever so slightly, I guess the broader frame is how do we decouple crisis from structural change? So people like Roberto Unger argue, and many others, that historically, and you cited this when you talked about, well, the last 4 decades and the 4 decades before then, it has taken something like a world war, a Great Depression, this call to arms to have any semblance of social solidarity, wartime production, the level of public works and public goods arose out of necessity because we were under attack by a visible, physical, human enemy. Now, we've tested this theory over the past number of decades. It's not effective when that enemy is, let's say, climate change, when it's amorphous, when it's not human, when it seems distant, when it can affect others and not you. Now we're kind of testing the hypothesis of whether it can be an invisible virus. And I'm going to read this piece of data, but I want to use that as a frame to ask you, A, whether you're optimistic about whether this virus can be that common enemy, and if not, what you would suggest doing. But one thing I've tried to do in the context of the politics and the power right here in New York's 10th district is just accept the fact that, again, crisis in the human mind is the thing linked to structural change. So I looked at the data from 1920 to 1932 during the Great Depression in Germany. And what you see is that the rate of unemployment, essentially after 1928, has a near 1-to-1 correlation with the increase in Nazi vote share in the Reichstag. And in this, one of the most Jewish districts in the country, I quote Theodor Wolff, who in 1933 said in a German newspaper, 1933, "It is a hopeless misjudgment to think that one could force a dictatorial regime upon the German nation. The diversity of the German people calls for democracy." This is 1933 in Germany. Last year, it was said, "Whoever controls the algorithms is the real government." Now, a couple of weeks ago, this went fairly underreported, but the Federal Reserve, the St. Louis Federal Reserve, showed unemployment predictions of 32%, of worse than the Great Depression. And we are living through this, and this is unfolding right now, here in the United States in 2020. So the question is, and how do we possibly build this politics of common good under duress? And yet simultaneously, how do we decouple the need to have crisis from the possibility of change?
Well, it's a very powerful question, Jonathan. And as you point out, the experience of the Great Depression produced Nazism, fascism in Germany, and opened the possibility for the New Deal in the United States. So I think it's certainly true that crises can have can bring about decisive turning points in politics, in hopeful ways and in dark ways. And maybe that's to suggest the stakes now for politics in the face of this pandemic. And we can see glimmers pointing in both directions. if we listen to the daily briefings of Donald Trump, we hear certain dark intimations. And if we look at the outpouring of appreciation for the work of essential workers in hospitals and throughout the economy, who normally do not get much respect, we see more hopeful intimations. And so the question is, what would it take to stave off the dark possibilities that are implicit in this moment? I agree, and we can't underestimate that. And to build upon the hopeful ones. One way we might build upon the incipient sense of solidarity that the pandemic has called forth would be to ask, all right, what would it take to create an economy of which we could truly say, we are all in this together? Well, let's start small. We know that there are people working on our behalf who are subject to tremendous risk, and many of them don't have health coverage. Those people delivering groceries and food to our doors, many of them don't have health coverage. People in the gig economy, or people in warehouses, or supermarket clerks. So why don't we say for 18 months, just for 18 months, let's extend, let's have Medicare for all, so that they are all covered. They're risking their health on our behalf, after all. And paid sick leave for everyone for 18 months. And then when 18 months come and go, then we can decide what we want to do after that. It's a starting point, a way of building on what could be an incipient source of solidarity. And then maybe instead of the emphasis on the unemployment insurance, what about considering the wage support that Denmark and Britain and the Netherlands have used during this crisis, where they have said we will pay 75 to 90% of the wages of every worker who is not fired. That's a way of lifting up the dignity of work in a tangible way, not an abstract, fluffy way, Jonathan, in a tangible way. It's revealing that we went for more unemployment compensation, but without widespread wage support or wage guarantee, where the federal government is the guarantor of last resort of wages. That would be another way. Let's do it under these emergency conditions, and then we'll see after 18 months. So that would be another very tangible way of trying to build a kind of solidarity that's implicit but unrealized in the present moment, and as a way of staving off the dark intimations, which are also present and which we have to guard against. We also have to make sure, talking about staving off the dark intimations, that the November elections are not postponed. We have to keep our eye on what's really important if we're to appreciate the real political implications and possibilities, the dangers as well as the hopeful possibilities of moments of crisis.
This is very timely and very, very apropos because one thing I'm actually doing now is being a party to a lawsuit of the New York State Board of Elections of canceling the presidential primary, in part due to the dangerous precedent it sets, which it says if the Democratic Party, the party that has the perhaps air of self-righteousness you've described, decides we've canceled our primary, there's no opportunity to express your vote, even though voting is already happening by mail. So there's no claim to be had that there's any ties to protecting voter safety. Then what moral high ground can one claim come November? And
well, so you're a party to the lawsuit against what the Board of Elections did in canceling.
That's right.
I think it's very important that you're doing that, Jonathan, because I think this could be a political misjudgment of very consequential proportions for exactly the reason that you say. It's just the wrong step to take if we take seriously the dangerous possibilities that are lurking not far beneath the surface in this crisis. So I think it was a terrible precedent for exactly the reason that you say.
But this isn't even unique or that shocking. In New York in particular, it was one of the 4 states, for instance, in 2012. Now, the context was different, but it canceled the primary then as well. And so, I guess this goes back to a little bit of the question of, is it merit or is it greed or blindness or what have you? Because how is it, Michael Sandel, that our leaders, the Democratic Party, the best of our elite, do not agree or see or have the incentives, perhaps, to agree with what you just said?
Well, we need new leadership, and we need to draw leadership from a broader range of the population. And we need less politics as usual, and we need less complacence and smugness in the political classes. We need less protection through gerrymandering and the like for incumbents. So we need to remake our politics. This pandemic is a public health crisis, but it's also a moral and civic crisis because it highlights the deficiencies in our politics and civic life that have been gathering for decades, really.
But there's no time like a crisis to consolidate power, to quash the democratic process and ensure, in fact, that this crisis, like any other, is used as pretense, for that consolidation.
I think there's a real danger of that. And I think canceling the primary was a terrible mistake.
So if we map out, let's say, the evolution from landed aristocracy to the meritocracy to now, how do you respond to, what's wrong with merit, right? Isn't the issue greed, or isn't the issue the abuse of power? Why is merit? What's merit got to do with it? Right.
Okay, that's a great question, and that's the kind of counterintuitive argument of my book. It isn't just greed. I think no economic system as far-reaching and as powerful as ours can exert a hold based on power alone. It also depends, for its staying power, on an ideological, a philosophical rationale. And one of the reasons...
But you have to unpack that. You have to unpack that for us.
Okay, well, let me explain. One of the reasons we've not been able to do much of anything about inequality, however egregious, for the past 4 decades, is partly it's to do with oligarchic capture and power, yes, but it's also that there is a kind of implicit and attractive and alluring rationale to do with merit. And the idea is this: we don't need in America, and this goes back a long way, we don't need to worry so much about inequality of income and wealth, because in America, people can rise. No one is consigned to live out a life in the class into which they were born. Upward mobility. That's the American dream. That's why, unlike those old societies of Europe, we don't have to worry so much about inequality as such. People can rise. The children of the poor can rise and become rich. So all we really need to do is ensure upward mobility, equality of opportunity, enabling everyone to go to college, having a chance at the American dream, the right to go as far as your talents and hard work will take you. So equality of opportunity, rising, mobility, that's even better than equality, or put it this way, it's a solution to the problem of inequality. And this is attractive, this is appealing, Jonathan. And so it goes beyond power. And I'm saying that this idea is a mistake for two reasons. First, it's not so easy to rise. Social mobility has stalled, and it's actually harder to rise up the income ladder in the US than in many European countries and in Canada for that matter. So
but isn't that a case for insufficient meritocracy?
Okay.
We just need a more perfect meritocracy.
Right. Okay. That's great. Yes. If that's all it were, then the question is, all right, let's perfect the meritocracy. But my argument is, it isn't only that we failed to live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. There's something flawed in the vision. And what's flawed is that even if we had a society where there were genuinely equal opportunity, this would not be a response to inequality. It would be a justification for inequality. Provided everyone is free to climb the ladder of success, it doesn't matter, from the standpoint of mobility, how far apart the rungs on the ladder become. But there's another problem, and this goes back to the attitudes towards success and failure, toward winning and losing, that even a perfect meritocracy encourages and promotes. Because if there were a truly equal opportunity, so that everyone landed according to their talents, without obstacles of prejudice or disadvantage, then those on top could really say to themselves, by golly, I did it on my own. I earned it. And looking at those less fortunate, well, they didn't go to college. They didn't work as hard as me. They earned their place. They deserve their place as well. So even a perfect meritocracy, if we could live up to it, would generate these the hubristic attitudes among the winners, and the sense of humiliation among the losers, that social roles and your income rank reflected your moral worth, your moral desert, how hard you had worked. And that is deeply demoralizing for those who don't land on top. And this, I think, is what accounts for a lot of the anger and resentment and frustration we see today. Not only that people have been left behind, but they have absorbed the lesson that those on top must deserve where they've landed, and those on the bottom must deserve their place as well. And that's a recipe for polarization and anger and resentment against elites. And that's what we've got. What do you think of that, Jonathan? Do you find that possible? Do you think there's something in it? Do you think there's something in it? Do you recognize it in our social life, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes, but I wonder what the data may show and from whose perspective the humiliation reigns.
Yeah.
So someone like Amy Chua has written in her book, Political Tribes, that in fact, part of the Donald Trump coalition, part of what the us on the coast missed is this belief that someone who is a billionaire, someone who has made it in real estate and business, it's not about him being one of them. Actually, there is an aspiration to be like him. And so if you actually talk to, so I'm wondering if, is there data that you're pointing to say, well, the biggest losers in the system, really it's about the sense of humiliation and the sense of hubris that the winners hold,
Right.
and hold on top of them,
Right.
or is that the winner's perception of what the losers think?
No, it isn't just that, Jonathan. It's true that Trump has been the tribunal figure for this anger and resentment, but it's important to distinguish between to identify the targets of this resentment and sense of humiliation. It's toward the professional classes. It's toward the people who, toward elites who have meritocratic credentials and who derive authority from those meritocratic credentials. It doesn't apply simply to rich people in real estate, let's say, who have managed to make a lot of money. You're right there. Many of the Trump voters say, yeah, we want to be like him. But what's interesting about Trump's political appeal is the one authentic thing about him is his sense of grievance, because he himself feels palpably that he's looked down upon, as he was indeed looked down upon by the Manhattan elites, whether in finance or in other aspects of professional life. And so here's one indicator. There are two measures of Trump support that are telling in this regard. First of all, it's important to recognize that we on the coast often forget. We tell people the route to advancement, you too can rise if only you go to college and get a good degree. But most Americans don't have a four-year college degree. 2/3 of Americans don't. Only 1/3 of Americans has any kind of a four-year college degree. So the idea that the solution to inequality and wage stagnation is send everybody to college does not speak to the experience of a great many people, number one. Number two, Trump won overwhelmingly among one of the greatest gaps between Trump's vote and Hillary Clinton's vote was on who had a four-year college degree. And this was true also in Brexit in Britain. Overwhelmingly, those who were without a four-year college degree voted to leave. Those with four-year college degrees or graduate degrees even more overwhelmingly voted to stay. And we're seeing this throughout social democratic parties of Europe. They no longer represent working people so much as the highly educated, credentialed, meritocratic professional classes. And this has driven away working class voters. It's been true in France as well as Britain, the United States. So that's one measure. Another indicator, another strong correlation of counties that voted for Trump were counties where deaths of despair were highest. Rates of death, especially among middle-aged men and women, through drugs or alcohol or suicide. So I think that these are indicators of the sense of not only resentment, but also a kind of exclusion, disempowerment, and despair of those who don't possess the meritocratic credentials that our society has come increasingly to prize, and that increasingly has predominated in the outlook, in the orientation, and in the policies of mainstream Democratic Party, or in the case of Britain, the Labour Party. There have also been interesting surveys, Jonathan, where they ask people to evaluate members of disadvantaged groups. And they ask about people who are working class, people who are members of various minority groups, and people who are not well educated. And in those surveys, those who are the less well educated are ranked at the bottom among the various groups. So credentialism has become the last acceptable prejudice, and it's almost an unspoken, unreflected on prejudice by professional classes, and it reflects the neglect by mainstream center-left parties of working people without a four-year college degree.
Now, let's hone in just for a second on these deaths of despair, because I agree, this is such a central, stark, shockingly under-discussed fact, which is American life expectancy had declined for 3 years consistently before any trace of this corona pandemic.
Right.
Now, but doesn't the shocking, tragically closed system idea of merit itself, it's so wonderfully self-reinforcing, right? I mean, you have a system where in the United States where people blame themselves, right? It's my fault. So
yeah.
So then people literally in the United States by the data drank and did drugs to the point where they killed themselves, to the point where American life expectancy declined for the first time in a century since the Spanish flu.
Yes.
Since the Spanish flu. So this is like a self-preservation mechanism, right? Where, if you lose, it's your fault. And how is that resolved? It's not externalized, it's internalized.
It is.
Internal combustion, and the system moves forward.
Yes, and exactly. The deaths of despair reflect the attitudes towards success and failure that a meritocratic society inflicts. And it shows, exactly as you say, that, let's put it another way, people who don't fare well can have two responses. They can say, it's unjust, the system is rigged. Or they can say, maybe I'm to blame for my failure. Maybe it's my fault that I'm out of work, or that the credentials I have aren't rewarded much. Maybe it's my fault that lacking a college degree, I can't get a decent job. And the second response, now often these responses are kind of mixed and combined in combustible way, but the second response, blaming oneself, is a reflection of this harsh meritocracy that has arisen almost without our recognizing it. And it's tragically displayed by the rise in deaths of despair, which are disproportionately which track those who lack a four-year college degree, even holding income constant. You might say, well, it's just that those people have a lower income and so they're more likely to despair. But even holding income constant, the two economists who have written about this, Case and Deacon, have shown that the deaths of despair have disproportionately track the lack of a four-year college education beyond income. So it's closely tied into attitudes that meritocratic credentialism inflict in defining success and failure.
Now, is this a critique? Is the goal to have a softening, to have a more inclusive, sort of common good type of meritocracy, or is there an alternative? We kind of know feudalism, we kind of know aristocracy, we kind of know the meritocracy. Is there some path forward, some alternative, or is it a more human-centered, more gentle version of the system that exists? Per your ideal construction.
Right. Well, I would say an alternative picture. We need an alternative picture of what it is to succeed together. And that means...
What is that?
Let me just try briefly to fill it in. First of all, equality of opportunity is a very important principle, and we should not give up on it. No one should be held back on the basis of prejudice or disadvantage or the family into which they were born. But it's important to recognize that providing genuine equality of opportunity is not sufficient for bringing about a just society or a good society. It is a remedial principle. We need to insist on it and to further it. But equality of opportunity alone, it does not give us a just society or a society that promotes the common good. For that, we require not equality of result, which would be impossible to achieve, but a broad equality of condition in which there were public places and common spaces in the course of everyday life that brought people together, whether public schools being foremost among them, public schools good enough to attract people from all social backgrounds and class backgrounds, but also public recreation areas, public parks, public libraries, cultural centers, health facilities, public transportation, all of which, not only because these are important services, but also because we essentially have come to live separate lives. The affluent have seceded from the common life and left public places and institutions to those who can't afford to buy their way out. So that's what I mean by creating, I suppose, a kind of civic infrastructure of a shared common life. This is what I mean by a broad equality of condition. It goes beyond the distribution of income and wealth, because the hope is that by encountering one another in the course of our everyday lives, we learn to negotiate our differences. We come to care about the common good. We come to have a stake in the common good. But we need to create the infrastructure, not just in terms of fixing roads and airports, but the civic infrastructure that gathers people together across class divisions, across social backgrounds, racial and ethnic differences. So this and more humility, I would just add this, Jonathan, since an important part of this are the attitudes, more humility on the part of the successful. So instead of those on top saying, I made it on my own, and I deserve all the rewards that have been showered upon me, those on top should have a keener sense of the contingency of our fate. And say, look at someone less fortunate and say, there, but for the grace of God or the accident of fortune or for the luck of the draw, there go I. I could have been that person. I could have been in that circumstance. I didn't make it on my own. There was a lot of luck in landing me here. And so humility, a certain measure of humility, it turns out, is a civic virtue and one that solidarity requires.
There is so much I want to get to and unpack and address and solve. I'm very mindful and conscious of the time. So I want to ask two specific points on that and see if we can get to one other. One is, can you point specifically to what you call this civic infrastructure or an institution, maybe in the United States, in our historical context? Can you point to a concrete example? Because we're talking about a country that privatizes prisons. We're talking about a country that provides monetary financial incentives to incarcerate a quarter of the world's prison population. I mean, we're talking not about just public parks and buses and private financing of public space. We're talking about a country that privatizes its prisons. Right. And you want I mean, how do we get from where we are to this vision of a civic infrastructure? And can you point to a specific example that might give us some hope around that possibility?
Well, we have a lot of specific examples in our history. The public schools, the common school, was invented. Horace Mann in the 1830s and 40s articulated the rationale for the public school in exactly these terms. It wasn't only to make sure that people who couldn't afford it could go to school. That was important. but it was also to bring people from different classes and different religions together and new immigrants to create a shared citizenship. That was really the whole point of the invention of the public schools. And I think and when Central Park was created, Olmsted's vision of Central Park was not purely recreational, to breathe fresh air in the midst of the city. It was that. But it was explicitly and deliberately for the sake of a civic project, to bring people from different neighborhoods and different walks of life and different class backgrounds together in a place where they would mix and mingle in casual, inadvertent ways. So Olmsted was like like Horace Mann before him with the public schools. Central Park had this civic class mixing mission. So there are two examples. Third example, public colleges and university systems, which in recent years, and this goes back to your points about commodification, have been so underfunded, are indistinguishable from private institutions. Some of the main campuses derive only a tiny fraction of their support from the legislatures. So here are three concrete examples. Fourth, public libraries. Andrew Carnegie with the idea of public libraries, and public libraries created whether through philanthropy or through public funding, aren't just so that poor people can read books too. That's the economic reason, the social justice reason, but as a place to gather people together. And so here are four concrete examples, and in our time we could proliferate them, but we've neglected. We instead think of economics. This goes back to my point that economics isn't only about money. It's also really about how we live together, how we value one another's contributions, the modest as well as the meritocratically exalted, and also how we organize our common life. So these are questions that involve money and public investment, but the rationale should include, so I would argue, a civic rationale to bring about a kind of moral and civic renewal.
Wow. Well, this could have gone on, and I always say this because it always feels and rings true, for hours, for days. And I think perhaps the point is that it should. This should not just be something that is narrowly cabined and siloed to the seminar classrooms of the elite. This should be actually what politics, now a dirty, very dirty word, perhaps always, is about.
Right.
And I'm so grateful to you, Michael Sandel, for just existing, frankly. You fill a tragically ever more necessary and gaping hole and void in our system, in our discourse, in our civic life. And I just am immensely grateful, and I hope all of you are inspired and encouraged to work towards this common good, towards this transformation of the systems and institutions and civic infrastructure that is possible.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much, not only for the generous words, but also for creating these dialogues, these series of discussions. You're broadening our conception of what a political campaign really should be about, which goes so far beyond the sloganeering and bumper stickers to really sustained, bringing people together for sustained dialogues on big questions. So thank you for everything that you have done and are doing to promote this better kind of civic life. Well,
I so appreciate it. Please do check out, if if this is the first time you're hearing about Michael Sandel, well, first off, where you been? But his forthcoming book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. Again, there is not a more important topic and just time for this dialectic, this discussion. So please do engage, do read, do like, subscribe, and comment to this channel to continue this type of engagement. And thank you all so much again.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Take care. Stay safe.
You too. Bye-bye.